How does a two-time UFC heavyweight champion, once feared as the most relentless fighter in the cage, end up trading his gloves for prison walls? Cain Velasquez's story is one of triumph turned tragedy. A Mexican-American icon, celebrated for his cardio and dominance, Velasquez was admired worldwide as a warrior and family man. But in 2022, one act of vigilante justice changed everything. He chased down a man accused of molesting a relative and opened fire on a vehicle, an act that landed him in court and, by 2025, sentenced him to 5 years in prison. This is how Cain Velasquez went from champion to inmate. Cain Velasquez's story begins far from the bright lights of the UFC. Born in Salinas, California, in 1982, Cain was raised in a proud Mexican-American household where work ethic and family loyalty were drilled into him from the start. His father, who had immigrated illegally before later becoming a legal resident, instilled in Cain the idea that nothing in life came easy and that you had to fight for every inch of success. That upbringing became the backbone of Cain's identity, shaping him into a man who would one day be both admired and feared. Cain's path to greatness began on the wrestling mats. At Kofa High School in Yuma, Arizona, he was already showing signs of an engine that didn't stop. His coaches would marvel at his cardio. He could push through grueling practices long after his teammates had collapsed in exhaustion. That toughness carried him to Arizona State University, where he became a two-time All-American. By then, Cain was known for more than just his conditioning. He was a relentless pressure wrestler who broke opponents mentally before the match was even over. But wrestling was only the beginning. Cain transitioned into MMA at a time when the heavyweight division was still plagued by lumbering giants who lacked stamina. Trained at the American Kickboxing Academy in San Jose, he sharpened his striking, adding crisp boxing and vicious ground and pound to his arsenal. When he entered the UFC in 2008, he was a new breed of heavyweight. He wasn't the tallest, the heaviest, or the flashiest, but he was the scariest, a fighter who could throw 100 punches in a round, drag you to the mat again and again, and never slow down. Within his first few fights, fans and fighters alike knew they were witnessing something special. His knockout of Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, a legend of pride and one of the most respected heavyweights in MMA history, sent shockwaves through the sport. Cain had demolished him in a way no one had done before. Fast, brutal, efficient. Commentators didn't hesitate to declare that Cain Velasquez wasn't just a contender. He was the future. What made Cain different was that he wasn't a trash talker, wasn't flashy, and didn't try to sell fights with theatrics. He was a quiet storm, humble in interviews, polite outside the cage. But once that door closed, he became a hurricane of violence. Fighters who trained with him whispered stories about how terrifying sparring sessions were, how Cain didn't just beat you, he drowned you in an endless wave of pressure until you couldn't breathe. The nickname Cardio Cain was born, and it stuck. By the time he entered the title picture, Velasquez was seen as the kind of athlete who could carry the heavyweight division into a new era. His Mexican-American heritage gave the UFC an opportunity to finally tap into one of the biggest fan bases in combat sport. For Cain, it was about pride, about representing his family and his roots. For the UFC, it was marketing gold. They billed him as the heavyweight who would fight for Mexico, a champion who could inspire millions. And for a while, Cain lived up to every ounce of that hype. He was unstoppable. He was dominant. He was everything the UFC had promised, and more. But what no one could have predicted was that the same fire and loyalty that drove Cain Velasquez to the top of the sport would one day drive him into making a decision so reckless, so final, that it destroyed everything he had built. Cain Velasquez reached the pinnacle of MMA in 2010 when he stepped into the cage against Brock Lesnar at UFC 121. Lesnar, a former WWE superstar and physical juggernaut, was the biggest pay-per-view draw in the sport. Fans expected the massive Lesnar to bulldoze Cain like he had with so many others. But Velasquez dismantled him with clinical precision, exposing the myth of Lesnar's invincibility. He stuffed the takedowns, battered him with strikes, and forced a first-round stoppage that crowned him the new UFC heavyweight champion. That night, Cain became the face of the division. The UFC wasted no time promoting Velasquez as their first true Mexican champion. He walked to the Octagon carrying the Mexican flag, his heritage celebrated in every promo package, his face plastered on posters in both English and Spanish. He was marketed as a national hero, not just for Mexican Americans, but for Mexico itself. Dana White saw him as the man who could break open an entire market, the fighter who could unify two massive fan bases under one banner. But Cain wasn't just a marketing tool. He delivered inside the cage. His trilogy with Junior Dos Santos became legendary, showcasing both the highs and lows of his career. In their first fight, Cain lost his belt in just over a minute, stunned by a right hand that floored him on live television. For many fighters, that kind of knockout could destroy confidence, but Cain came back with a vengeance. In the rematch, he suffocated Dos Santos for 5 rounds, unleashing one of the most brutal one-sided beatings in UFC history. In their rubber match, Cain did it again, proving beyond doubt that he was the better man. His dominance was terrifying. He overwhelmed opponents like Bigfoot Silva, Antonio Bigfoot Silva, and Travis Brown, all victims of his relentless pace and ground and pound. Commentators began saying Cain wasn't just a champion. He might be the greatest heavyweight to ever do it. Fans adored him. Mexican boxing legends praised him, and his peers respected him. Unlike many fighters, Cain didn't need antics to sell fights. His violence was enough, but behind the glory, injuries began taking a toll. His training style, infamous for its intensity, left him battered. Shoulder surgeries, knee injuries, and back problems plagued his reign. Entire years of his career were lost to recovery, robbing fans of the dominant champion they wanted to see. Still, whenever he returned, he reminded the world of who he was. He was Cain Velasquez, the cardio machine, the heavyweight nobody could keep up with. During these years, Cain's image was larger than life. He was the proud Mexican warrior, the humble family man, the champion who never gave up. But even as his career slowed, the values that defined him, loyalty, family, and protection, never wavered, and it was those very values that would one day push him into crossing a line from which he could never return. Because while Cain Velasquez was a man who fought for his family in the cage, in 2022, he would fight for his family in a way that shocked the world, with a gun in his hand and a reckless plan that would cost him everything. For Cain Velasquez, the turning point didn't come in the Octagon. It came in February 2022, when his world outside the cage collapsed. The incident centered on Harry Goulart, a man accused of molesting a young relative of Cain's at a daycare run by Goularte's mother in San Martin, California. According to court documents, the accusations were horrific, and for Cain, a man whose entire identity was built on protecting family, the news was devastating. The details struck a nerve deeper than any loss or injury ever could. Cain had built his life around loyalty and sacrifice, preaching the importance of family in countless interviews. Fans who admired him as a fighter also saw him as a role model, a husband, a father, and a man who carried the weight of his Mexican heritage with pride. But beneath that calm and disciplined exterior, the thought of someone harming his loved one ignited a rage that would burn uncontrollably. When Goulart was arrested, there was hope among Cain's family that the justice system would take its course. But that hope was short-lived. Goulart was released on bail, allowed to walk free while awaiting trial. For Cain, it was a betrayal, not just of his family, but of the very system that was supposed to protect them. To him, it seemed like a mockery of justice. The man accused of violating the most sacred boundaries of family life was walking the streets, free to live his life, while Cain's family remained scarred and broken. In moments like this, people can either trust the law or take matters into their own hands. Cain Velasquez, who had spent years fighting inside cages under strict rules, now faced a situation where the rules seemed rigged against him. In his mind, there was no fair fight. He saw one option: to make the man responsible pay. Friends later described Cain as deeply distraught, consumed with anger and frustration. He was a fighter trained to act, not wait, and now the very values that had made him a champion, loyalty, protectiveness, and resolve, were twisting into a dangerous obsession. Cain believed he had to do what the system failed to do. The setup for tragedy was complete. Cain Velasquez was about to step outside the cage and into a real-world battle he could not win. And unlike his legendary fights against Brock Lesnar or Junior Dos Santos, this wasn't going to end with victory. It was going to end with handcuffs, humiliation, and the shattering of his legacy. February 28, 2022 was the day Cain Velasquez crossed the line from champion to criminal. That afternoon, he spotted a vehicle carrying Harry Goulart, along with Goulart's stepfather, Paul Bender, and another passenger. Cain pursued them through the streets of Santa Clara County in a high-speed chase that turned suburban roads into a battleground. Witnesses described the pursuit as reckless and terrifying, with Cain chasing them for miles. At some point during the chase, Cain pulled out a firearm and opened fire on the vehicle. Multiple shots were fired as he attempted to hit Goulart, but instead, his bullets struck Bender, the stepfather. The injury wasn't fatal, but it was serious enough to require immediate medical attention. In that single moment, Cain Velasquez had destroyed his own future. For fans, the news was surreal. Cain wasn't just arrested, he was booked on attempted murder and 10 other gun-related charges. The champion, once celebrated for discipline and composure, had snapped in the most public and irreversible way possible. Headlines around the world shifted from praising his fights to condemning his actions. Cain Velasquez, arrested for attempted murder, became the new defining phrase of his career. The incident raised haunting questions. How could a man who spent his life channeling aggression inside the rules of combat let it spill so recklessly into the real world? Was it the years of pressure, the toll of injuries, or simply the unbearable rage of a father figure who believed the system failed his family? No matter the reason, the reality was undeniable. Cain had endangered innocent lives, put himself on the wrong side of the law, and forever altered his legacy. When the police arrived, Cain was taken into custody without resistance. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The UFC legend, the champion, the hero to millions of fans, was now in the back of a police car, his hands cuffed, his reputation shattered. The same man who once stood atop the heavyweight division was now facing a future measured not in title defenses, but in prison years. The attempted murder wasn't just a crime. It was the death of Cain Velasquez's career, and as the news spread, the MMA world reacted with shock, anger, and disbelief. Some would rally behind him, seeing a man driven to desperate measures. Others condemned him, saying that Cain had crossed a line that no champion, no matter how beloved, could ever justify. When news of Cain Velasquez's arrest broke, the MMA world was shaken to its core. This wasn't just another fighter caught in a scandal. This was Cain Velasquez, a two-time heavyweight champion, a man many considered one of the greatest to ever step into the cage. For years, he had been celebrated for his discipline, humility, and family-first image. And now, overnight, he was in headlines for attempted murder. The reactions were immediate, and they revealed a deep divide across the sport. Some fighters and fans came to Cain's defense. They argued that any father or relative in his position would have done the same thing. Former UFC champions, coaches, and even active fighters posted messages of solidarity online, saying Cain was simply protecting his family in a way the justice system had failed to do. Hashtags like #FreeCain began trending, and petitions calling for his release gathered thousands of signatures. For many, he was no longer just a fighter. He was a symbol of a father's love, taken to the extreme. But there was another side. Critics pointed out that Cain hadn't just confronted Goulart. He had pursued a vehicle at high speeds and fired multiple rounds into it. Innocent lives were at stake. The bullet didn't hit Goulart. It struck his stepfather. For many, this was proof that Cain's actions weren't heroic. They were reckless and criminal. To them, Cain had crossed a line that could never be excused, no matter the motive. The media seized on the drama. Sports outlets that once praised his cardio and championship grit now dissected his downfall, calling him a fighter out of control. Talk shows debated whether Cain Cain should be celebrated as a vigilante or condemned as a danger to society. Fans who once shared highlight reels of his fights now shared memes of his mugshot. What made the shockwave so powerful was how quickly Cain's image flipped. He had never been a trash-talking villain, never the kind of fighter who invited controversy. He had been the quiet warrior, the humble champion, the role model. And yet, in the eyes of many, the shooting incident revealed a darkness that had been hidden beneath the surface. The debate split the MMA community in half. Was Cain Velasquez a victim of a broken legal system, or was he a man who proved that no amount of glory in the cage can excuse reckless violence outside of it? No matter the side, one thing was certain: Cain Velasquez's name would never be the same again. After his arrest, Cain Velasquez's world transformed from championship arenas and press conferences to the cold walls of a jail cell. He was denied bail multiple times, forcing him to spend month after month in custody while awaiting trial. For a man who had once been in complete control inside the Octagon, he now found himself powerless in the justice system, dependent on lawyers and judges to decide his fate. Reports from those close to Cain painted a picture of a man struggling with the reality of incarceration. Gone were the training camps, the roar of the crowd, the spotlight of pay-per-view events. In their place were locked doors, limited visits, and the endless monotony of prison life. For someone whose entire life had been built on discipline and physical exertion, the adjustment was brutal. Yet, even behind bars, Cain still had supporters. Fellow fighters sent messages of encouragement. Fans wrote letters, and his family stood by him. Photos emerged of Cain appearing calm in court, even smiling at times, as if determined not to let the world see his despair. But for all the public bravado, insiders described a man grappling with guilt, anger, and regret. Prison stripped away the aura of Cain Velasquez the fighter and left only Cain Velasquez the man, vulnerable, flawed, and facing the consequences of his actions. He no longer looked like the unstoppable champion who once tore through opponents with relentless energy. He looked like someone broken by the weight of his choices, someone who had stepped outside the cage and discovered that the real world doesn't give rematches or second chances. The silence of his career became deafening. While other fighters moved on, signing new contracts, headlining events, and chasing championships, Cain's name disappeared from fight cards and promotional posters. He was no longer an athlete, he was an inmate, and every passing day in jail pushed him further away from the sport he had once defined. The tragic irony was clear. Cain Velasquez had spent his life mastering the art of controlled violence, learning to strike with precision, to fight within rules. But one act of uncontrolled violence destroyed everything. Behind bars, Cain could no longer fight opponents. He could only fight time, and time was an opponent no champion had ever beaten. After 3 long years of court dates, hearings, and delays, Cain Velasquez's fate was sealed in March 2025. Standing in a courtroom in Santa Clara County, he faced the charges that had defined his life since that February day in 2022: attempted murder and multiple weapons violations. For months, speculation had swirled about what kind of punishment a former UFC champion would actually receive. Would his fame and popularity with fans lead to leniency? Or would the courts make an example out of him, showing that no one, not even a sports icon, was above the law? The answer came when Cain entered a plea of no contest to attempted murder. By doing so, he avoided a lengthy trial, but it also meant he accepted responsibility for his actions without directly admitting guilt. The judge handed down the sentence: 5 years in state prison. The announcement carried a finality that no fan, no fighter, and certainly not Cain himself wanted to hear. For a man who once seemed invincible in the cage, the image of him standing in court, head bowed, as his punishment was read aloud, was a gut punch to the MMA world. Cain Velasquez, the champion who once represented Mexican pride on the biggest stage in combat sports, was now a convicted felon. His legacy, once written in highlight reels and championship belts, was now tainted with courtroom transcripts, and mugshots. The courtroom itself was a scene of tension. Family members of Cain wept quietly. Supporters who had shouted "Free Cain" outside the courthouse for months stood in silence. Even some fellow fighters who attended looked stunned at the reality that their brother in arms would be spending years behind bars. The media wasted no time framing the sentence as the closing chapter of Cain's career. Headlines declared Velasquez sentenced from champion to convict. Talk shows debated whether justice had truly been served. Was 5 years too little for an attempted murder? Or was it too much for a man who, in the eyes of many, was simply defending his family? Regardless of where people stood, the verdict marked the official end of Cain Velasquez's time as an active fighter. There would be no more comebacks, no surprise returns to the Octagon. The story was finished, or so it seemed. Because what most didn't realize was that the sentence carried a twist that wouldn't be revealed until later, a detail that complicated the idea of justice even further. The announcement of a 5-year prison sentence seemed like the final nail in Cain Velasquez's career. The MMA community, though divided on whether the punishment was just, assumed this was the end of Cain's story. For many, it was over. Cain Velasquez would spend half a decade behind bars, his name permanently scarred, his fighting legacy overshadowed by the crime. Fans who once watched him dominate the Octagon now pictured him confined to a cell, his body aging, his skills wasting away. But behind the legal language of the sentencing, there was a truth the public didn't immediately see. Cain's time in custody since his 2022 arrest counted toward his sentence. With credit for time served, legal experts revealed he was unlikely to spend the full 5 years in prison. In reality, Cain was expected to serve about 1 more year before being eligible for release. When that detail emerged, it sparked another wave of controversy. Supporters of Cain saw it as a victory, a sign that he wouldn't be left to rot behind bars, that he would still have the chance to return to his family and perhaps even rebuild his life. But critics erupted in outrage. They argued that attempted murder, reckless endangerment, and firing into a moving vehicle demanded harsher accountability. For them, the idea that Cain could walk free after serving only a fraction of his sentence was a miscarriage of justice.